Understanding end-time scriptures can seem pretty daunting, often downright confusing, and like only elite Christians like trained pastors, teachers, or theologians can be trusted with interpreting these types of scriptures. But I think we need to understand, though the Bible is inspired, it is a text just like any text, and so it stands to reason that it can be interpreted by using the same basic critical thinking and interpretation techniques we would use to interpret any text. In fact, I think many of us can make the mistake of believing someone else's interpretation of end-time scriptures and not thinking critically for ourselves. Now, the interpretation that we heard may not be wrong, but unless we learn to interpret for ourselves, we can't be sure it's right either. So here's two important concepts I've learned in my studies that have helped me to understand and interpret end-time scriptures much more easily, and I hope they help you too. The first one is compare scripture with scripture. If you've ever done any type of Bible study or hermeneutic classes, you've more than likely learned about something called audience relevance. Considering audience relevance means considering what the writer meant and how the original readers would have understood the writer's words. You see, culture and time can have a big impact on the meaning of words. Here in the southern states of the US, a biscuit is a type of bread that should only ever be eaten with gravy. But in Australia, where my family comes from, a biscuit is a type of cookie, because culture can have a big impact on the meaning of words. 80 years ago, if I were to point to a man and say that man there is gay, I would be meaning that man is happy. But today that would have a different connotation, because time also can have a big impact on the meaning of words. So when we read the end times prophecies in the Bible, we need to understand that it was written almost 2,000 years ago to a culture very different from ours. There's more than likely many words in the Bible that meant something very different to the author and the original readers than what they mean to us today. Now, fortunately, you don't need to be an ancient Hebrew or Greek scholar or anthropologist to know what these words meant to them. We can know a lot about audience relevance by comparing scripture with scripture, seeing how these words, terms, and phrases are used in other parts of scripture, mainly the Old Testament. Words like heaven and earth passing away or burning up, the sun going dark, the moon not giving its light, the stars falling from the sky, the Lord coming on the clouds, a day of the Lord, a seven-headed beast. If we want to make sure we are interpreting these words accurately, we must consider how the people back then would have understood them, not just interpret them through our own 21st century Western mindsets. Now, this second point may be a bit controversial, but if we want to interpret these scriptures properly, I believe it's very important we consider this honestly and with an open mind. And that is to pay attention to the time statements we see in scripture. Most of us have learned to ignore, dismiss, or read over the many time statements saying that the end times events were near, soon, about to happen, at hand, or would happen shortly. Now, if it was just a few times here and there in the scriptures, it might be understandable not to look any further. But Jesus, the apostles, and the angels in Revelation repeatedly and emphatically state that these events were going to happen in the first century. Jesus said in Matthew 16:28 that some of those standing in front of him back then would still be alive when he came in his kingdom. He said in Matthew 24 verse 34, that generation would not pass until the events took place. Peter, Paul, James, and John frequently said things like soon, near, shortly, at hand, and about to take place concerning the end times. There is more than 100 statements like this in the New Testament. Now, we may say that Jesus made them think that the end times events were soon so that they and everyone after them would always stay ready and waiting. But do we really want to accuse Jesus of manipulation and deceit? We really only have two ways of interpreting the end times scriptures. The first way is to interpret the nature of the end times events to be literal, say that all the time statements are non-literal or figurative. This creates a problem because it makes the word of Jesus seem unreliable, untrustworthy, confusing, or even deceptive. The second way to interpret end-time scriptures is to interpret the time statements as literal and look for alternative interpretations of the nature of the events by comparing scripture with scripture. If we do this, we can actually find ample evidence for the nature of the events to be symbolic and metaphorical. For instance, if we read in Deuteronomy chapter 31 verses 26 and 28, we see the Mosaic law is called Israel's heaven and earth. If we read Genesis 37 verses 9 and 10, we see that the sun, moon and stars represent leaders or authorities. And if we read Isaiah 13 verse 10 and 13, Isaiah 34:4 and Nahum chapter 1 verse 5, we can see that heaven and earth being shaken, burnt up, or the sun, moon and stars falling, going dark or not giving their light is metaphorical for when a city and therefore its governing system and the leaders and the authorities under that system were destroyed. And if we look at Deuteronomy chapter 33 verses 26 to 27, Psalms 18 verse 9 or Isaiah 19 verse 1, we can see that the Lord coming on the clouds is metaphorical for the Lord moving in power through an army to destroy a city or another army. And did you know that in AD 70, soon, from when the apostles said the end times events were to soon happen, in the generation Jesus said the things would happen in, the Roman army destroyed Jerusalem, the temple, and everything to do with the Mosaic law and the Old Covenant, Israel's heaven and earth, and destroyed the priesthood and the religious leaders of that system. That is, their sun, moon, and stars. Did you ever wonder why the tribulation is referred to as Jacob's trouble, not the whole world's trouble? I'd encourage you to think again about how we've interpreted the time statements Jesus and the apostles gave. Relook at these words describing the end times events, and compare scripture with scripture to see how the original audience would have understood these words. I'm Micah Stevens. God bless, and thanks for watching.